And so this is a great resource available. It is a website, nativeland.ca. You can see the actual web address there on the page. And one of the things that I appreciate so much about this resource is that I want to make sure. Right. Um, I toggled on over to the resource itself. I love this disclaimer. It talks about honoring the sovereignty of all Indigenous nations, their lands, their waters, and an encouragement to make sure that we're checking in with our local elders, local community members, as well. So you can go to the map and you can actually put in your own address. I'm going to put in my zip code. I'm here in Walker, Minnesota. It'll zoom you in. And you can see the territories of the folks who have lived here in the past, still contemporarily today, as well as the languages, the treaties that might impact it, so on and so forth. And so it's a really great opportunity for us to lean into knowing a little bit more about where we might live today and who both ancestrally and contemporarily shares this land with us. So again, we know that it's important to take a pause to acknowledge and celebrate the land we're on. As I mentioned, I'm joining you from Walker, just miles off of my beautiful Leech Lake Nation homelands. And it is the current ancestral home of the Anishinaabe people, as well as the Minwakota and Dakota people. And while there is a history of stolen land, attempted genocide, and forced removal of these original people of the land, today we also want to lift up and celebrate joy, success, and wisdom, and all of the many contributions our Indigenous communities share with us today. As we get going, I want to acknowledge a couple of things. First and foremost is that this topic can feel heavy. However, what I really want us to lean into is remembering that when we're able to learn more together and have kind of that shared common history around the realities of what's impacting all of our communities today, then that enables us to be able to move forward together more authentically. So you see on the screen here a quote by an author, Linda K. Hogan, from the Chickasaw Nation, and she says this: "Walking, I am listening to a deeper way. Suddenly, all my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say. Watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands." And so, my friends, as we venture into this journey together this evening about learning about historical trauma and how it's impacted our Indigenous communities, and we talk about the hard things, the trauma, the abuses, all of those things that our communities have endured, we also must remember, and more importantly, we must remember the love, the beauty, the sense of safety and security that is passed down from one generation to the next as well. We're going to take a moment and really think a little bit more about what brings us here to this speaker series tonight. We know that we're probably all coming off of maybe a busy day. Maybe you just finished dinner or putting dinner away. What I invite you into in this moment is just to take a moment to be where your feet are planted, right? To acknowledge the reasons that brought you here this evening, to kind of open your mind up to new information you might be hearing for the first time, maybe some information that maybe is a little bit difficult to hear. Be self-aware. If you're feeling something that might land wrong, we call them pinch moments. Be curious about it. Um, be curious. And so as we kind of center ourselves into this space together, I encourage you, as we are going to watch this clip together, to really pay attention to your five senses, to notice what it feels like to be sitting in the chair you're joining us from, to watch the imagery on the screen that's presented in this video, to listen to the sounds, both the voice of the speaker as well as the music, the rhythm of the drum. and just take some time to notice and to wonder. So think about what might be coming up for you as you listen to the words of this video, as you watch the imagery, and we'll come back together in a moment. So a couple more things about this video. It is by Thomas X. He is a musician from Red Lake. You'll actually see him in the video. He's also the director of the Red Lake Boys and Girls Club. So you'll see him sitting with a student, doing some homework in some of the scenes here in this video. Thomas Barrett is his name. Thomas X is his stage name. And this piece is called The Medicine, and it's featuring Brendan Strong. So again, listen to the words, take some time, take some deep breaths if that's helpful for you, as you really lean in to this next piece here.
I don't believe we're getting that sound.
Thank you. I thought I clicked the right button.
It's in our language.
Now we got it.
One moment here. It was coming through my speaker instead of through the
Oh,
official sound. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can reshare.
sounds good.
Sorry about that.
That happens to me too.
There we go. Share sound. All right, I'll start that video over here.
The medicine is inside you. It's in our best days. It's in our first steps. It's in our gratitude. And when we feel like we have nothing left. It's when we work, when we play, when we hurt, and when we pray. The medicine is inside you. It's in our language, our culture, our lands, our clans. It's in the air, the water, our sons, our daughters. The medicine is inside you. It's in the future, it's in the past. It's in the rough days that never seem to last. It's in our heart, our spirits, our voice. Can you hear it? Step one, day one, month one, year one. We are the medicine.
Well, complete with technical glitches, right? I'll be sure to drop the link in or to include the title of that so you can watch it in its full glory without kind of skipping around there. But as you reflect on that video, I am curious if you'll open up your chat. What did you notice about that imagery, about those words, and what do you wonder? Go ahead and take some time to kind of chime in there. I'll share a little bit with you about why I like to share that video in particular. I do a lot of work with a lot of helping professions, whether it's educators in a Western school system, whether it is health and human services workers, whether it's community members who are looking to really be able to provide support and encouragement. That repeated refrain of "you are the medicine." So often, really well-intentioned folks will come to me and say, "What is it? What is it that I can do? How is it that I can help?" Whether it's a youth that may be in need, whether it's a community member who is struggling. A lot of times people come in and just wonder what they can do. And so often, human connection, right? Compassion, empathy, being able to be there for one another, even if that experience is something that we've never experienced ourselves. There's such profound healing when we're willing to do that. And so hearing again, we are the medicine. We are what we each other needs. So I really appreciate the reflections that people are sharing in the chat. Yes, lots of points of connection that we're talking about here today. And so those themes will continue. That was just a brief opportunity to hear all your voices in this space as well. And we will have more at the end with both some discussion questions as well as then some breakout rooms and question and answer. And so I really appreciate people taking the time to be able to lean into that with me. That was a mindful moment, maybe in a different way than what you've experienced before. Really what we're talking about when we're thinking about mindful moments is that opportunity to ensure that our nervous systems, our brains, our bodies are regulated, that we're ready to learn, we're ready to listen, we're in our prefrontal cortexes. And so our own regulated nervous system is the best intervention we can bring to any situation. What that really means is that when we're in our thinking brains, when we're in our best space and we come into someone else who might feel like they're in chaos or who might be having a really hard day, when we bring our own regulated selves into that space, oftentimes that connection, that empathy, that understanding that we can show to that person, then also allows them to feel more at ease, to feel more a sense of safety, a sense of calm, a sense of belonging, a sense of connection as well. And so really, what we've already walked through today is a concept that I use often in all of my work. And I feel like it's incredibly important when we're talking about challenging topics such as historical trauma, that we make sure that we're regulated, that we're really ready to relate to one another, and we're ready to take in new information. We're ready to reason. And so I won't spend too much time here, but already in the time that we've spent together, I have really tried to cultivate this space to be one of safety and connection, so that we can all take time to learn together this evening. And that comes from Bruce Perry's neurosequential model and his 3 R's. All right. So as we get going this evening, before we jump directly into historical trauma, I find it incredibly helpful to understand a little bit more about the concept of toxic stress. So we know as human beings, we will never, ever, ever escape stress. It is a part of life. However, what I want to add and what I want to differentiate here in our time together is that there are different kinds of stress. So again, experiencing stress is a part of the human experience. And positive stress, for example, is essential for healthy development. It's what makes your heart rate increase on your first day of school or your first day of work when you're meeting new people. It's those butterflies you feel in your stomach before a big test or a big presentation or performance. And in fact, positive stress helps us perform better. It helps us be at our best. So again, physiologically, we're feeling that increase in heart rate and a mild elevation in our stress hormone levels. And then there's tolerable stress. It's a response to a more severe stressor, but limited in duration. So an example of this could be a fender bender, breaking a bone. And then what I want to really lean into is the concept of toxic stress. Toxic stress is marked by strong, frequent, and or prolonged adversity. So experiencing physical or emotional abuse, exposure to community violence, particularly without reprieve or without any supports or protective buffers. So toxic stress, what exactly does that look like when we're thinking about the impact it has on us as individuals, as us as families, as us as communities? This is a graphic created by ACE's Connection and Building Community Resilience Collaborative Networks, the International Transformational Research Coalition. It provides a more comprehensive and holistic way to frame the human experience around stress and trauma. So you can see in this illustration, there are 3 parts. The tree represents individual stressors or kind of the household stress. If you're familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, the study from the early 90s by Doctors Anda and Felitti, they really focused in on 10 adverse childhood experiences in particular happening within that child's household as they were growing that really have an impact then, both in childhood and later on in life. So those are represented by the tree there. You can see everything from parental separation and divorce, physical and emotional neglect, to domestic violence and substance abuse issues within the home. Now we know that those adverse childhood experiences, those traumas and adversities are impacting us as we grow, as we learn, as we experience the world around us. Now I want you to now shift your attention to the soil. So I want us to think about the soil that tree is growing in as our communities. You can see that there are many things in that soil that kind of look like a lack of nutrients. And so when we think about lack of jobs in your community, substandard wages, living in poverty without access to resources, structural racism and historical trauma, as well as discrimination, are also part of that soil. If we don't have a rich soil, it's really hard to grow healthy and strong. And now thirdly, I'll draw your attention to that kind of tornado graphic in the corner. That's what's in our environment. So even beyond that soil that we're growing in, we're also impacted by the other things happening around us. Everything from climate crises to natural disasters to the pandemic. All of these might be impacting individuals, families, and communities in a different way. However, that also we need to take into account the buffers, right? The protective systems and resources and supports we have in place that will really help change the trajectory of whether that is a tolerable stress or a toxic stress. So now I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I did want to provide this extra context because I think it's really important that we consider that in our human experiences, there is potential for us to be exposed to and to endure all kinds of different traumas and adversities. And the more that we're aware of the potential impact, the more that we can be proactive of creating those types of supports that will help buffer how severely we're impacted by those stressors to hopefully change the trajectory from being a toxic stressor to a tolerable stressor. All right, so in that previous graphic, we really saw that conceptualization. Many folks might be already familiar with the adverse childhood experience study. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time there, but it's hard not to mention it when you consider that a lot of the intergenerational traumas and adversities that our Indigenous communities are experiencing are underscored by these experiences of adversities in childhood that more likely than not is passed down intergenerationally. So if my parents are struggling, then I learn how to parent from my parents, and then I might struggle in some of the same ways. I'm going to take a drink of water here. Thank you. I was feeling a little bit of that tickle in my throat here as I spoke. So again, the pyramid on the screen is a conceptualization put forth by Rise, who it's informed by youth, and this is really what they saw in terms of going beyond the adverse childhood experience study hypothesis and pyramid that often folks see, to include at the bottom of the pyramid, the foundationally what we're impacted by is intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, as well as then exacerbated by some social conditions or local contexts that we may be experiencing. Again, if you are interested in delving more into the whole range of these topics, I would encourage you to check out the podcast, Remembering Resilience. And I'll mention that again at the end because we really walk through each piece of this in more detail. Now, I wanted to bring all of these different forms of trauma and adversity into the conversation before we jump right into historical trauma, because I think it's really important that we understand the scope of the things that we're talking about at this time. So as you think about all our world today, your own community, perhaps your own family or your own story, why might these additional topics be important to consider? And how might individuals, families, and communities have been impacted? Now, feel free to kind of chime in the chat or just keep these questions with you as we continue to go through a little bit deeper information, particularly into our Indigenous communities and that connection with that toxic stress that has been experienced through these eras of historical trauma we're about to talk about. All right, so I pose a question back to you again this evening. Go ahead and open up that chat. There is no wrong answer. What comes to mind for you when you think of your roots? As you're thinking and contemplating that, I'll go ahead and share a little bit about what comes to mind for me. So you see the photo on the screen here is of me with my two sons. They're much older now. In fact, my oldest son who's standing next to me is actually taller than me now. It's crazy how time flies. um, but I chose this picture in particular because it is a family tradition for us every fall to visit a local farm, to go to the pumpkin patch, to visit the corn maze, to kind of have that fun seasonal tradition that we look forward to. Um, when I think about this question, what comes to mind when you think of your roots? I imagine my boys being asked this question as adults. I hope they talk about having fun together as a family, spending time together, our traditions, the things that we look forward to every year. My oldest son's father immigrated from Mexico. And so when Isaiah goes down to the Morris area to see his dad and step family, Spanish is the first language spoken in the home. So I hope for Isaiah, he also thinks about his rich cultural heritage, not only as an indigenous family, but as well as his rich Mexican heritage that he shares as well. I think about how my youngest son's dad is a well driller. They have drilled for water and allowed families to set up homesteads for multiple generations. It's a multiple generation family business. So I would imagine he might think about that legacy, and how far back it goes in terms of being able to allow people access to water. So there are many things that might come to mind for you, right? Your heritage, the family trade. Um, I see in the chat some great comments to Sunday dinners, good food and laughter, honoring my ancestors, breaking those generational traumas for our children. Yes, thank you for those contributions. Um, I for my boys, right, I kind of name those easier things to name, but for them, perhaps they'll also think about how much of a struggle it was at times to be raised in a one-parent household. They might think about the struggle that they endured growing up in a community that isn't always accepting of differences. They may think about how sometimes they were looked at or treated differently because of their cultural heritage. So again, when we think of our roots, there's so much of it that might be able to give us strength, and there might be much of it too that really compels us to create different legacies, to create different stories for our future generations to come as well. So when we think about how the experience of previous generations impact who we are today, what we're really talking about is this relatively new scientific field uh, known as epigenetics. Now, it's new in the Western conceptualization of it. And that now that Western ways of knowing science and research really is able to prove this point, it's more widely accepted to talk about. However, as Indigenous people, we've had concepts um, that a similar concept as epigenetics since time immemorial. It's the reason why we talk about the 7 generations, that we're impacted by the 7+ generations that have come before us, and that we impact the 7+ generations that come after. We're called to make our decisions based upon that, right? To really think about how can we be good ancestors to those that come after us. And so I want to draw your attention to the photos on the screen. On the right-hand side, you'll see children, children right here in Minnesota. Does anybody have a venture a guess as to what those photographs are of? Where are those children? Those are both photographs of children in boarding schools right here in Minnesota. So the top one is at White Earth. The bottom is up in the Bois Forte Nation near Tower. There were over 15 boarding schools, at least for 15 boarding schools right here within Minnesota. And it really is a complicated legacy when you think about our first exposure as Indigenous people to the Western educational system came through an institution that was designed to kill the Indian and save the man. It was intended, the explicit intent of the boarding school system was to take away our culture and instead to assimilate us into mainstream white society. I won't get too far ahead of myself as we're going to talk a little bit more in depth in that in a moment. So I also want to balance out the picture when we think about epigenetics and its impact. So please also now draw your attention to the center photograph. Can anybody tell me what they see there? I know it's kind of hard to see, but if you zoom into that baby's face, that is a sweet Ojibwe baby being carried by a mama on a cradle board in a traditional way. Yeah, Ojibwe beadwork on a baby board. And that baby is snug and secure. That baby feels safe. That baby has the cutest little cheeks and a big smile. And I would venture to guess that baby feels loved. That baby feels safe and secure. And that baby feels connected. Now, I want us to remember, as much as we're talking about trauma and adversity in our time together tonight and how that is passed down epigenetically, we also must lift up and remain, keep in our minds how love and positive experiences and strength is also passed down from one generation to the next as well. So in order to understand more about epigenetic inheritance, we are going to take a quick look at a study done by scientists at Emory University. So scientists at Emory University had a hypothesis, and their hypothesis said that they believed that traumatic experiences could be transmitted across generations. So they set out to prove this hypothesis by doing some research, and they did an experiment with mice. Male mice were exposed to the scent of cherry blossoms. And every time they were exposed to this smell of cherry blossoms, they received a mild foot shock. So over time, these mice were conditioned to fear the smell of cherry blossoms and associate it with danger. Now, then these male mice were then bred, and the resulting pups were never exposed to those conditions of the experiment. However, the first time those pups smelled cherry blossoms, guess what happened? They reacted in fear. They cowered in the corner. They crawled on top of each other. They weren't sure why or what it was they were afraid of, but they knew that something was signaling to them that when they smelled cherry blossoms, they were in danger. This experiment actually extended out another generation. And researchers found that they were born with more cherry blossom detecting neurons in their noses and more brain space devoted to cherry blossom smelling. Now, why might this be? What does it all come down to? Survival, right? So these mice were born by inheriting epigenetically a heightened sense of danger when smelling cherry blossoms, in order, in theory, to protect them from having to endure that danger themselves. So their DNA itself remained unchanged, but what changed was the epigenetic markers that then influenced how the genome is read. So I kind of like to think of it of a light switch flipping on or off. Okay, so somehow through the process of epigenetic inheritance, these mice, their light switch was switched on to fear the smell of cherry blossoms. What's interesting to me is that these scientists, led by Dr. Diaz, Brian Diaz from Emory University, then went to research how, through the mouse equivalent of cognitive behavioral therapy, that these original mice in the condition to fear the smell of cherry blossoms were cured of that fear through cognitive behavioral therapy. And then when they were bred, the resulting pups no longer carried that fear of cherry blossoms forward with them. So again, there's so much hope in this research and in this news, because we know that while traumatic experiences can be transmitted across generation, so can healing. So that leads us to historical trauma itself. This term, as applied to our Indigenous communities, was coined by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. Yellowhorse Braveheart is one of the lead experts on historical trauma. She has a lot of work out there and is still currently researching today. The terminology that Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart used when talking about historical trauma was the definition you see on the screen. She calls it cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. This researcher was a Lakota woman, and she first started studying historical trauma because she saw the contemporary issues that her community was struggling with. So while the Lakota community is one community that struggles with historical trauma, we know that there are so many more examples as well. So her research expanded to include descendants of Africans who were brought here and then enslaved. It also included research around descendants and survivors of the Nazi Holocaust and descendants and survivors of the Japanese internment camps, among many, many others. So unfortunately, we have too many examples of whole groups of people experiencing that cumulative and emotional and psychological wounding, those traumas that are carried across generations. And so in the interest of time, I found a video that was put together by youth when they were asked, what is it that you would want other people to know and to understand when it comes to our community, our Indigenous communities, and how we've been impacted by historical trauma? So this video, called We Shall Remain by the Style Horse Collective, was put together and informed by Youth Voice. And that's one of the most important pieces of this that I'll note, and the reason why I appreciate being able to use it when we're talking about these topics. Our young people understand so much more than we give them credit for often. And they're able to very eloquently explain historical trauma in their own words. Give me a thumbs up if the sound is working correctly as I press play here.
One morning I woke up and I heard my brother crying. He was screaming so loud you thought someone was dying. Mom, Dad, he screamed, but there was no use trying. They weren't around. I ran outside and saw he'd had a pretty bad crash. His bike was in the ditch, down his arm a bloody gash. He looked so pitiful just sitting there in the dirt amongst the trash crying, "I want Mom and Dad." I picked him up and started running toward my uncle's up the way. It started raining and got real dark. You could barely tell it was day. My brother cried and asked, "Sister, where's Mom?" I didn't know what to say, when the truth is, I don't know. When my uncle saw us coming, he ran into the yard. He took my brother from me and he held him in his arms. When he saw my face, I could tell he was alarmed. And he said, "What happened? Did you fall too?" "Uncle, I'm so tired of wondering why. Why do they drink? Why do they do drugs? Why do they leave us? Why?" He said, "Sister, it's hard to explain." And I said, "Uncle, try." And then he told this story.
Once this land was teepees as far as you can see. The water was clean, the land pristine. We were where we were meant to be. Then strangers came across the sea and brought with them their disease. Our people cried and prayed and sang, but it brought them to their knees.
We will rise up from the darkness. We will overcome the pain. Warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
Imagine that your family, and most of all your tribe, what if most of everyone you love suddenly got sick and died? And before you even had a chance to bury them and mourn, the strangers came and took away the land where you were born. And you wondered if your parents even cared as they stole you and your brother away, or if they'd been so beaten down they had nothing left to say. And then at school, they cut your hair and beat you if you spoke the language that Creator gave our people when earth awoke.
We will rise up from the darkness. We will overcome the pain. Warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
Sister, I'm not trying to tell you that your mom and dad are okay, or that they're not responsible for the choices that they've made. But you see this bloody wound on your little brother's arm. If we don't clean it, it won't heal, and it'll do all kinds of harm. Those deep wounds of our ancestors still bleed within our hearts. When we remember all they've done, that's where the healing starts. So every morning when you wake, you pray this prayer out loud. Creator, help me live in a way that would make my ancestors proud.
We will rise up from the darkness.
Don't you forget this. You can be anything you want to be.
We will overcome the pain.
Just work hard, never give up. Perseverance is the key.
Warrior spirits live within
Strength, dignity, honor, that's all in your family tree. So hold your head up high and know that.
We shall remain. We will rise up from the darkness.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
We will overcome the pain.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
Warrior spirits live within us.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
We shall remain.
brother, we will overcome the pain. Remember, warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
As I said, I feel like that's such a powerful depiction. Um, and in the words of our youth, of walking us through those kind of different eras of historical trauma that Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart outlines as well. So now I'm going to reshare my screen. How can I get the video? Okay. So any thoughts, notices, wonders, reactions after watching that powerful video? You know, one of the things that strikes me is that it really helps us remember what and wonder and be curious about what that lived experience might have been like from first contact on, right? That imagery of imagine that in your village you're a child and all of a sudden all of your family, all of your neighbors, all of your community suddenly is getting sick and you don't understand why. um, would you say that might have felt like a toxic stressor for these little ones in their bodies, right? Being constantly flooded with cortisol, with adrenaline, with kind of that fear of not understanding what's happening as these strangers are coming into the land. Now, that is the first era that Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart talks about as well, when it comes to historical trauma in our tribal nations, is that idea of first contact. We know that because our relatives who are living in what is now known as the United States, but what we've called Turtle Island, we had never been exposed to a lot of the diseases being brought over by the settlers, the colonizers who were coming this way, and so we didn't have immunity to a lot of those diseases. um, I wonder too about contemporary day relatable things, right? Such as COVID as well. But when you think about how from first contact on, in addition to the diseases that were brought over, how there were a lot of skirmishes that turned into outright war between the native nations who were already living here and the people that were coming in to immigrate here, because they wanted a better life for their families as well. So there was warfare, there was really attempted genocide is what it amounted to, as the what is now known as the United States policy on the indigenous communities living here began to form. So we have that point of first contact, warfare that took place. We have again depicted in the second photo in the screen, then removal and relocation. The most famous era that many of us have learned about in our history books is the Trail of Tears, right? The removal of many tribes over to Oklahoma. However, there were a lot of other instances of removal and relocation happening as well. Right here in Minnesota, the original plan was for all 11 of our tribal nations, Anishinaabe people as well as Dakota people, to be moved up into the land that is now White Earth. Now, when you think about our geography and our environments here in Minnesota, you have a lot of differentiation, right? From our lakes and trees up here to the prairies and grasslands in western and central Minnesota, to even, the river and basin, down in far southern Minnesota. And so again, I just encourage you to learn more about our state's history. It isn't just Native history, right? It's Minnesota history. It's important to understand a little bit more about what the policies were here within our state and how it was impacting our Indigenous people as well. So in addition to removal and relocation, I want to draw your attention now to the photograph on the screen in the far right-hand corner. You see a man standing down at the bottom and then one on top. Does anybody know what that man is standing on top of?
Buffalo
I think about our
skull.
plain, yeah, skulls. Thank you, Marcia. Yeah. Buffalo skulls, just the skulls. And so when you think of our plains neighbors, that relied on the buffalo, not only for a food source, but for shelter, for clothing, for medicines, for spiritual significance. One of the other tactics used by the settlers at the time was destruction of our flora and fauna to control what was dubbed and explicitly called the Indian problem. And so by decimating the buffalo on the plains, our Dakota, Lakota, Nakota neighbors, their communities were rocked by loss of the buffalo, in large part due to purposeful, willful intent of destruction of that resource. I could spend so much time on each one of these eras, and I want to be mindful of time. So again, I urge you to continue to do your own research into each of these historical trauma eras, but I wanted to touch on each briefly. The other piece that then kind of following around in that circle is the boarding school experience, as well as conditions on the reservations. And so once the reservation system was set up, it was really, again, one of those tools used to try to control our indigenous communities. And there was such widespread starvation happening in the reservation settlements because our people weren't used to having to stay within these kind of invisible boundaries, right? We knew that what paths our game, our wildlife might have followed, and we would follow them to hunt them. But again, when the boarding school, I'm sorry, when the reservation system came around, we were told that we could not leave these reservations for fear of losing our lives. So again, I'm giving you the real brief overview of a lot of these eras for which we could spend a lot of time on. But to give you kind of an idea of how detrimental these policies, these eras were to our native people, that around first contact, from first contact, I'm trying to find my numbers so I make sure to give you the right numbers. The numbers pre-contact in what is now known as the continental United States were estimated to be between 5 and 18 million indigenous people living in these lands. But by 1900, after the impact of disease, warfare, removal and relocation, conditions on reservations, our numbers were hovering around 250,000. So from 5 to 18 million, and even if you go with the low side of that estimate, right, down to 250,000. 200, yeah, and so when you really think about that impact, it really was attempted genocide in terms of how these eras impacted our indigenous communities. The other thing I'll mention, I won't go too much into the boarding school era, knowing that our next speaker next month will be kind of delving into that deeper. But as I talked about a little bit in the beginning, the stated impact of the boarding school system was to kill the Indian and save the man. Richard H. Pratt was considered the father of the boarding school experiment, and his plan was to kill the Indian and save the man. So to erase everything about our culture and our connection to who we are as a strong indigenous people, and instead to assimilate us into white culture. After a lot of the abuses and neglectful situations were uncovered within that boarding school era. The Miriam report was really what uncovered a lot of the sexual abuse, physical abuse and neglect, emotional abuse and neglect that took place there. Boarding schools began to close, but that goal of assimilation continued and switched institutions from the educational system to the welfare system. And there was the adoption and foster care era in which Native children could be removed from their home for any reason without any home study or investigation needed. And so when you think about these institutions that still exist today, right? Our Western education system, health and human services, social workers, the child protective services system. What I'm not doing today is pointing the finger and placing blame in a way that degrades any of those institutions or the important roles they play in our communities. So please hear my heart in that. What I am saying, this is even more troubling, is that I believe that the folks working at boarding schools and those that were involved in the adoption and foster care era truly believed that what they were doing at the time was in the best interest of our people. And for me, that is a call to action to take pause and to be very introspective at all times and to do that critical self-reflection, right? Because if those folks thought they were doing what was best at the time, um, then we must also always be mindful of how are our actions today impacting other people in ways we might not realize now, right? Or are we seeing things through our own cultural lens? And our own cultural relativism, right? We believe that this is best because this is the way we do it. This is the way our culture does it. This is the way our family has always done things. But when we place that unfairly on another group of people who might have different traditions, different customs, different ways of child rearing, different ways of raising and sustaining their families. And we really need to be mindful of that, right? And make sure we're not doing harm when we're in fact trying to maybe do the best we can with what we know at the time. As I mentioned, um, there's a lot more to say about all of those eras, but what I really want us to get to in our time together tonight is to think about what does this mean contemporarily for all of us? What does this mean in terms of being um, those folks in our communities who want to help, who want to be good allies, who want to come alongside community members and really create change in a positive way? So I do have to pause on this quote here because sometimes people will hear this information and they'll be a little bit skeptical. However, there are so many examples in research that these policies were done with ill intent, with knowing the harms it would cause upon our people. And here's one example. So this came from the annual report of the General of the U.S. Army to the Secretary of War in 1878. This general says, "We took away their country and their means of support, broke up their mode of living, their habits of life, introduced disease and decay among them, and it was for this and against this they made war. Could anyone expect less? Then why wonder at Indian difficulties?" Now, some folks might be hearing this information and say, but that happened so long ago. And yet we know um, discrimination continues. Stereotypes are perpetuated in what people think about Indigenous community members. Discrimination exists. And our communities are struggling. For most of us, how did we learn how to parent? General, by how we were parented, right? So what happens when whole generations of children were raised in the boarding schools and they were not raised by their families in a loving way that's consistent with our cultural teachings, and instead they were raised in a cold institution? It's no wonder that at times we see neglect happening within our own homes. And oftentimes it's because when you don't have that example of strength-based parenting, cultural-based parenting, it's parenting's hard work in itself, right? But when you don't have that example to draw upon, that can be really difficult too. The other thing I'll mention is that when those children were removed from homes and sent to the boarding schools, that was when we really began to see an increase in alcohol abuse within our Indigenous communities. We know that alcohol can numb pain, and we know that people were hurting without their babies with them. We also know that as Indigenous people, we hadn't been exposed to alcohol prior as well, and our systems weren't made to metabolize it. And so when we really think about, instead of what's wrong, why we see disparities when it comes to substance misuse in our Indigenous communities, let's think about what's happened and where the origins of alcohol and other substance abuse came from. So the slide on the screen right now shows some data here in Minnesota. This is particularly looking at adverse childhood experiences. However, I really want us to think about how how much disparity there is in the way our American Indian Indigenous communities experience these adversities and traumas in comparison with others here within the state. So you can see that, for instance, in our white communities, about 7% of people have experienced 5 or more adversities in childhood. When you look at our Indigenous communities, 23% have experienced 5 or more ACEs. That's nearly 1 in 4 of us carry a lot of that adversity, toxic stress, and trauma within our own life experience, as well as intergenerationally, whether our parents or grandparents have experienced it as well. Now, again, we know that in the boarding school experience, children were separated from their families and from their parents. They suffered physical abuse and neglect, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse as well. And so it's no wonder that, again, we still see the contemporary impact that that's having on our community members. Because of that attempted cultural genocide, our rates of substance abuse, mental illness, physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, and incarceration are very high. Now, again, this is heavy information, but believe me, it's not all doom and gloom. And so I really truly believe that in order to to understand a problem, you have to understand the root causes of it. I will mention as well, sometimes people hear the term historical trauma and they think you're just talking about what happened 500 years ago. That's part of the picture, but there's so much more. Historical trauma sometimes is a misnomer because it is also about what is still currently happening today. I have a tickle in my throat. I'm sorry, I need another drink of water. Thank you for bearing with me. Now, the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and other relatives is something that plagues all of our Indigenous communities. And in reality, everybody in Minnesota should be paying attention to this. Minnesota was the first state to establish a task force to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women and other relatives problem. To give you an idea of how much of an issue this is for us, you see some statistics on the screen, but I'm also going to pull out the fact that as an Indigenous woman, I'm 10 times more likely to be murdered than any other demographic. I'm 2 times more likely to be the victim of a violent crime. For us as Indigenous people, murder is the 3rd leading cause of death. Native people make up only 2% of the US population, yet 82% of Indigenous men are victims of violence in their lifetime. Here in northern Minnesota and in the Bemidji area, Nevaeh Kingbird, Jeremy Jourdain, there are names of teenagers that are on the tip of my tongue because we know that they're still missing and we don't know what's happened to them. They're starting to make more headlines here in Minnesota, but why is this not national headlines, right? All of our missing young people. You know, I really love the message on the sign down in the corner. She shouldn't have to be your mother, daughter, sister, or cousin for you to care. There's a wealth of information out there if you want to get more involved in being part of the solution to this epidemic, and I just would really encourage you to find out more. The photos on the screen here are from a group, MMIW 218. They are on social media. They're very active in our communities. They just had a gathering for Emily Pike. Please say her name, Emily Pike. She is the very young teenager whose body was discovered after being missing. So again, there's so many, she wasn't local to Minnesota, but again, here in Indian communities or in our Indigenous communities, we see and we stand in solidarity with all of our other tribal relatives who are feeling the same type of pain because of this epidemic. There are other historical traumas that are ongoing that are impacting us contemporarily. When you think about environmental justice, when you think about water, which is our lifeline for every single one of us, not just us as Indigenous people. When you think about what's happening to our Indigenous relatives at the borders, when you think about what's happening with voting rights. There's so many things that are disproportionately impacting our Indigenous communities that we have to pay attention to, that we have to speak up about. And so I would really encourage you to do more research, to learn more for yourself and for in your home communities where you're from across the state of Minnesota, to find out how you can get connected, how you can be a good ally. Now, this information's not easy even for me as a presenter who does this professionally to talk about, because so often, as this quote on the screen talks about, creating change is uniquely difficult for American Indians. For to do so, American Indians must articulate the problem to others who rarely share similar experiences or look at the problem in a similar way. Thus, American Indians trying to create change find themselves in the untenable position of always complaining about something. As a result, when American Indians raise their voices to draw attention to problems which need solutions, they find themselves the target. They become the problem. I think about the importance of diversity, of equity, of inclusion, of belonging. This isn't only for us as Indigenous people. This is something all of us as Minnesotans need in our lives. It enriches our experiences. It enriches our connections. It doesn't divide us. It makes us stronger together. And so I want you to think about your own world, your own community, your own family, your own experience as an individual. What might the cherry blossoms be for you? And by cherry blossoms, what I'm referring to is to really think about kind of that epigenetic inheritance piece, right? What has happened to your parents, your grandparents, the ancestors that came before that might still be impacting you today? Because I'm here to share with you the truth that not only have our Indigenous community members been impacted by the collective historical traumas that have been impacted on our Indigenous communities, every single one of us has, because our ancestors all played a role. And here my heart is not about pointing fingers or placing blame, but it's more so about becoming aware of the harms that were perpetuated and still continue to this day. And about being part of the solutions, right? I know that you're all here because you want to learn, because you want to be able to be the change that we all want to see in the world today. And I appreciate you all taking that first step by being here in this space. It's not an easy space to be in, especially with this topic area. But I really appreciate people's willingness to be more aware of these concepts and how they impact us. So just some food for thought there. So think about those questions as you kind of contemplate. And then what I want to move into is shifting our attitudes. So kind of the traditional way we might react when we see behavior we don't understand is to think that there's something wrong with people. Why is it that these families keep getting broken apart by substance abuse in the home? Why is it that people are still struggling despite their best efforts? So we need to move away from that traditional model that people don't care. They just need to be punished. We need to stop making excuses and do a more trauma-informed approach where we recognize that many people care, but maybe they're lacking the skills or the understanding or the supports or the resources to be able to make the types of changes they want to make in their lives. We really need to think about how trauma impacts us, both as children as well as into adulthood. So that really helps us ask that question and have that perspective shift from what's wrong with you instead to what has happened. What's happened in this person's life? What types of traumas might have been passed down and what might be impacting us? But not to stop there. We also need to move forward into the idea of what are the strengths that have been gained from these experiences? What is right with a person? What is it that they can take and use in a different way that will really allow them to step into their full being and into their full potential? So in a moment, I have some discussion questions on the screen, and I know Renee also was planning to put us into into groups. Before we get there, I'm gonna kind of go ahead to a couple additional slides that I want to make sure we don't miss. So as much as we've been talking about trauma, we also need to learn about Indigenous brilliance and success. There is so much out there. There's so much to celebrate. There's so much revitalization, both with language and culture. We know that connection to culture, connection to language is a huge protective factor across all different types of potential harms. Everything from preventing or from cultivating a strong mental health and well-being to preventing youth substance abuse and misuse, right? So when we're able to feel like we belong in community and to feel a connection to something that's bigger than ourselves, that helps protect us. That's a protective buffer from those toxic stressors that we were talking about earlier. And so what is it that we can do to take action? Keep learning, right? So on the screen, you see a relatively new museum that's in Park Rapids, Minnesota. It's the Giwedanung Treaty Rights and Culture Museum. I would encourage you to follow that website, to take a drive over if you're ever in the area to check that out. It is amazing from what I've heard. I'm planning on taking my boys very soon because Park Rapids is pretty close to us. There are many other places you can go to learn as well. I just wanted to lift this up in case you hadn't heard of it before. Think about your own community and your own community's story. I shared that resource earlier about native land, so you can research more about the land where you live and the language, the culture, the treaties that impact your area. And I love this quote here by Marcus Garvey. A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots, right? Learn about your roots, learn about your community's roots, learn about what else might be impacting the community and your neighbors that you share your area with. And then finally, as Renee already mentioned, the podcast Remembering Resilience is another great resource. I had the absolute pleasure of working with Susan Bolio, David Knoyer, and Brianna Matrius on the Remembering Resilience podcast, and then later with Dee Dee Drift as well. We put together not only 3 seasons of this podcast, but also conversation guides. So if you want to start a club with some friends, some neighborhood friends, and to learn more about this, each episode has a conversation guide to go along with it that has key questions, keywords, and resources to deepen your learning, and really intends to be, again, that opportunity to deepen your understanding around these topics that we've touched on really briefly this evening. So finally, what I want to leave you with, again, is the idea that we are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I am colonially underserved. I am institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient. Those are the powerful words from Abigail Echohawk, a Pawnee woman who is the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute out of Washington State. That is a national organization that really works to kind of reclaim some of the data that impacts our Indigenous communities. I'll leave the other quotes on the screen for you to contemplate, and then I'll turn it back on over to Renee to give some additional steps.
Linsey, thank you so much. I cannot say how much I appreciate you coming today and presenting. Every time I hear this, it makes me think anew about this topic. And I would love to have time for questions, but we are getting close to the end. So I did put some questions into the chat, and I would love to have people go for about 8 minutes into little breakout rooms and have a chance to talk with each other just a little bit and have some processing time. So if you don't want to go into a breakout room, you can stay here, but I'm going to open up 4 breakout rooms, and I'm going to send you into them automatically, and then you can come back when you I'll give you a minute warning to come back. So the rooms are open. Please go in, take a look at the questions, and talk with each other.
Hi, Renee.